Hello and welcome to our 2025 edition of our Kreston Academies Benchmarking Report. Pleased to see that many of you have joined us on this cold but bright morning, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Becky Foy, one of our senior managers, and myself, Darren O'Connor, one of the partners here at James Cooper Kreston. Over to our first page, please. So today we will talk through the benchmarking report, which covers off approximately 260 trusts, which is 2,300 schools across our network, the Kreston network. It's based on the August 2024 accounts, which were all filed just before Christmas, obviously on an anonymised basis. Within the report, we break it down into primary, secondary, and maths to help each school better divulge and look into the data to best suit their needs. I always say with benchmarking reports or benchmarking data, it'll only ever give you the starting point, and certainly won't give you all the answers, but is food for thought and starts the brainstorming process and the breaking down of perhaps the norms. Next page, please. So moving to the data pages towards the back of the report, we have a useful definition section, which I think is useful. The academy sector clearly has lots of jargons that perhaps if you're in it every day, you understand, but perhaps if you're on the outside looking in, it can be quite hard to distinguish between some of the terms. So I think that's always a useful page. It then moves on to the data. And as I say, that's split into various different categories. Primary, secondary is fairly self-explanatory, but then also maths, and we break that into different sizes of maths, as I'm sure we're all aware that a smaller math has a very different characteristics to perhaps a 20 plus school math. Next page, please. So highlights, so a bit of a spoiler alert, so I'll keep this very, very high level here because we'll cover it off in much more detail as we go through the report. But I think one of the broadest messages coming out of it is a decline in financial position. This clearly does vary depending on the size, and I think it's more acutely an issue for smaller maths, but generally there is a decline in the financial position of schools and their balance sheets and their reserves. I suppose that's unsurprising given the economic backdrop, the state of public finances and so on. It's probably not too surprising to see that as one of our highlights. So what does that mean for the sector? There's clearly a need for a focus on efficiency savings and also perhaps some centralisation and taking advantage of value for money and economies of scale where it can be done. So that has led to an increase in gag and reserve pooling at a trust level, so the money can be better spent in a flexible and value for money approach. I suppose one of the other highlights has come out, and this was flagged last year as well, is some of the demographics and population statistics over the next few years does state that in the short and perhaps medium time, there could be a fall in pupil roll across the education sector, not necessarily just the academy sector, and what that will do to schools. Well, it's likely to lead to even a further strain on budgets, but may actually lead to school closures in some areas. So it's interesting to see how that will play out. You've obviously got as well the independent sector, and some of the changes that's happened to independent schools may or may not lead to a flow of new pupils into the academy sector. I think it's too early to tell yet, but depending on what papers you read and what your news outlet is, it does feel as though at some point there will be a tipping point with pupils moving into the academy sector. Next page, please. Okay, so I'll hand over to Becky now to start talking through some of the other aspects of the report.
Perfect. Thanks, Darren. So firstly, moving on to the financial position then. So although this year's been considered somewhat more stable compared to prior years where we've seen a number of kind of global events having significant impact on the sector, the overall position of Academy Trusts this year, based on the benchmarking results, is that all trusts have still struggled. This has been evidenced through an increase of the in-year deficits from 47% to 60% when comparing against the prior year. With that said, for another year, results were still better than expected due to receiving a number of extra grants which weren't originally budgeted for at the beginning of the year. Therefore, I guess without these extra grants being received, a lot more trusts would have fallen into that in-year deficit position. And then ultimately, these in-year deficits have had a knock-on effect on the reserves positions of all trusts. And on average, all academy trusts are experiencing a decline in their free reserves. Although, having said that, the larger MATs are holding up the best. This is probably due to the economies of scale they're able to achieve. And then further to this, I guess then with the level of free reserves falling, the results are now suggesting that over 30% of the trusts are now holding less than 5% of total income as reserves, which is firstly under the DfE targeted levels. And then secondly, trusts that are performing close to the suggested level, it is then unlikely that they're going to have the sufficient reserves to be able to invest in capital projects to assist with estate planning. So this really does stress the need for trusts to have better reserves. However, with most struggling to balance the books at the moment, this is difficult in the current climate. And then lastly, on this slide is very interesting, I guess, moving into some of the grant withdrawals this year. One being the Trust Capacity Fund grant, and then the startup grants, which were provided to trusts initially to help expand. Based on the current figures, the DfE are thinking that they're going to save around 30 million with the reduction of this grant. But then, interestingly enough, that the results obviously show that the larger MATs are performing far better than the smaller MATs and SATs. So therefore, the removal of these grants are almost disincentivizing trusts from expanding, when surely based on the results of the larger MATs are in a more favourable position, that this is probably the model that the government maybe should be encouraging. Next slide, please.
Okay, so thanks for that, Becky. So we thought it would be useful to have some polls as we went along to gauge what trusts are currently seeing in a real and live way. So our first one here today is, over the next 5 years, do you expect your trust reserves to? Please open the poll. I'll mention that again. Over the next 5 years, do you expect your trust reserves to increase, decrease, or remain at a similar level? As Becky mentioned, I think the benchmarking report suggests that it is going to be a tight time for reserves. It'd be interesting to see what our viewers here today are experiencing or expect to receive. So I'll just leave that open for another 5 or 10 seconds, and then we'll close the poll. Can we close the poll, please? So interestingly, most would see a decrease, which would support the benchmarking report that we've put together and Becky's commentary on it. But I think it is going to be a difficult period. Interestingly, no school or no trust today has predicted an increase. So we've got no hopeless romantics amongst us. But anyway, we'll leave it there. Okay, please close the poll. So moving on to the next slide, please. Becky.
Okay, good to me. Cool. So moving on to income then, and as expected, with the additional funding received in the year, there has been an overall increase in total income per pupil. And excluding the capital income, on average, this increase was about 8.2% on the prior year. Specifically looking at GAG, this has only changed marginally, with small MATs even reporting a decrease in this year. However, given the amount of additional grants being received from the DfE, and along with some changes in the categorizations, mainly in the sixth form funding, using GAG in isolation now is probably not the best benchmark, and therefore when looking at kind of ESFA, DfE grants, it probably should be looked at in combination now. In terms of capital income, most schools will receive their capital income through applications for SIF funding, or if the trust is large enough, will automatically obtain the SEA funding, which will guarantee a set amount of funding on an annual basis. However, this can only be obtained for MATs with at least 5 schools and 3,000 pupils. The report shows an overall trend that the capital income per pupil is decreasing, with primary SATs being hit the hardest with a reduction of 90% since 2022. And then the main driver for this is just a lot of primary SATs have been unsuccessful on bids. But with that said, secondary SATs have fared okay, with grant funding increases of around 58% since 2022 again. And I guess the overall message there is that the FCA funding is a far more favourable position due to kind of the guaranteed annual income, which allows the trust to have clear estate management plans in place for the future, whereas the smaller MATs and the SATs just don't have that availability. And then investment income, trusts have seen another year of growth, which has been driven by favourable interest rates, and trusts having much more of a consideration of where they're depositing their funds. And we've seen over the last year or so, many trusts are now depositing on these online platforms, which allow multiple savings accounts to be used, which provides higher interest rates. And then just looking at the future funding as well, then the government has pledged an extra 2.3 billion to school funding next year, only representing 1.44% in the real terms. Of this funding, 1 billion has already been set aside specifically for the SEND funding, and this is to try and help the ongoing deficits in the high needs budgets. And then there will also be another allocation to fully fund the teachers' pay awards. So although these funding announcements are going to be welcomed by all schools, it is unlikely that this is going to be enough to cover kind of all the other rising costs that won't be able to be captured from the SEN or the pay awards. Next slide, please. So moving more onto the costing side then. Again, as per prior years, when we're asking trusts what their key concerns are for future costs, teaching and non-teaching costs are still featured right at the top of that list. That's not surprising given kind of like the increases in the pay rises, and then sometimes the uncertainty of how that's going to be funded, with a lot of the announcements on funding coming out a lot later. The pressures of increasing staff costs as well. We're going to continue with the rises in the minimum wage and the NI. And as we can see in some of the tables, the cost per pupils are showing a broad, steady increase across all trusts as pay awards still exceed the income that's being received. And then pensions. So the teacher's pension obviously increased from the 1st of April 24, but some relief was given via additional grants. But then on the other hand, the LGPS percentages have remained fairly static for a number of years, although there's quite a lot of variation across local authorities in terms of what that percentage looks like. And we are still seeing quite a decline in the pension liabilities on the balance sheet at year end, with even some in this year moving into either a nil or asset position. What I would say with that is that there should be caution taken with these balances and the valuations, as they're hugely dependent on the economic and demographic position at the time, which has really been demonstrated over the last few years with the huge swings that we're experiencing. And then moving over to kind of the CEO and CFO salaries. So the CEO salaries for another year have increased across the board. The primary, secondary, and the smaller MATs having somewhat of a modest increase, on the basis that a lot of these individuals will still tend to be on the leadership scale points. The larger MATs have seen a higher growth in the year. The DfE has softened the approach to setting remuneration, which has allowed what obviously is the higher increases in these salaries. And then looking at the CFO salaries, there's been quite a lot of variation in that as well. This is likely due to kind of the settling of wages following a high period of inflation. And then still being key is supply costs. Over the last few years, again, we've seen supply costs be a large concern, mainly driven between the staff shortages and sickness. Teacher sickness still remains very high at 66%. This has only dropped 1% compared with the prior year. This percentage has also been based on teachers taking at least 1 day sick per year. Staff retention, as I noted, was also a key factor for all trusts. Vacancy rates are still high, sitting at about 2,800 compared to 1,100 about 3 years ago. This kind of emphasises that trusts will need to continue to look at more favourable and flexible terms for employees to help keep the retention in the schools, and the need to actually then look for supply costs which come at a premium. Next slide, please. So then looking at the non-staff costs, we can see that the non-staff costs have risen a lot more slowly in 24. This has been driven by a combination of both kind of a declining inflation rate and then the stabilisation of the energy costs. These are kind of the two areas that trusts have struggled with over the last few years. The CPI only rose 2.2% in the last 12 months compared with 6.7% in 2023. And then when comparing the increase in non-staff costs per pupil, this is reduced to 8% in the year, whereas last year was still around 16%. And then in 2024, trusts seem to be less concerned about energy costs. The energy cost per pupil has reduced from around £169 on average to £158. And although this is not a significant decline, at least we're still not seeing these large increases that we have done over the past few years. But the consensus across the board around the non-staff costs is that the majority of the cuts that could have been made have been made now, and there's really very little more to give by further reductions, which would actually show any significant future benefit. Next slide, please. Last one, I think. So just moving on to the balance sheet then. So the number of trusts with cumulative deficit reserves are still in single figures, but on average, because of the in-year deficits, this has increased on the prior year. Primary SATs have shown better results than the prior year, although they're still experiencing a deficit. These are likely due to a lot of the underperforming MATs over the last year or so being merged into bigger MATs. And then when looking at free reserves per pupil in the table on the screen, the decline hasn't been too bad, although this is not favourable, with the medium MATs being hit the hardest with a drop of around 18%. Cash balances have held up well, although already noting a lot of this is because the trusts are now thinking a lot more in terms of investments, and as I noted, a lot of people are now using investment platforms to maximise the returns on higher interest rates. And then fixed assets. So most trusts are aware that asset management and estate management is becoming a greater emphasis. Trusts having to explain in the financial statement what plans are in place to ensure the safeguarding of these assets. This comes off of the back of a few challenging years in respect of land and buildings, first being subject to potential RAC issues a couple of years ago, and then in the last year, some issues with system-built schools. The government did announce in the autumn budget further funding for school rebuilding programmes and general building maintenance. However, based on the available grants, it appears that only those that have access to the SCA funding have kind of a good and better understanding of estate needs and have these estate plans in place. But for those who do not qualify and have to rely on the SIF bids, they're tending to struggle, as it's very hard to know what to budget for with the application process and not knowing if they're going to be successful or not. This has really been highlighted with only 36% of applications being successful in the last funding round. And a lot of this is to do with the criteria in the point scoring process. It now appears that trusts have to commit a lot more of their own reserves when applying to secure the highest points in certain categories. of which some schools are unable to do so due to not having the reserves in place, or if they did commit, it would reduce their reserves to a level that would be under their set policies. So with that said, this suggests that only those that apply for, those who apply for SIF funding will find estate management a lot harder to navigate, with uncertainty around future capital, and likely have a lack of free reserves to be able to actually fund these larger projects which are necessary. And then the last kind of big change, I guess, is that historically finance leases have really been a no-go area for trusts on the basis of requiring approval from the DFE before entering into. So a lot of trusts just didn't go near them. However, from the 1st of September 24, the handbook has changed, allowing a wide variety of finance leases now to be entered into without pre-approval. This very much falls in line with the upcoming changes to the accounting standards. These are implemented from the 1st of September 26, which will require operating leases to be accounted for in the same way as finance leases. So this might actually be beneficial to trusts, as they might be in a position where they can make commercial arrangements that they wouldn't have done previous just because of those approvals in place. So that's everything from me, I think. So next slide, please, Gabriel.
Great. So multi-academy trusts. So within the last 12 months, we can see a small increase in the number of multi-academy trusts, probably slower than it has been previously. And I suppose there's various reasons for that. Perhaps we're beyond the tipping point, and it's now the marginal increase each year will be lower. Probably new government has also had some impact, or will have some impact in the coming year. The messaging coming out of the government is still slightly unclear as to what their view on the academisation will continue to be. Some of the messaging, I suppose, the removal of the conversion grant, the 25k for schools converting, perhaps indicates a slight cooling off of academisation. Also, some of the messaging around failing schools wouldn't necessarily need to join a MAT. And likewise, new schools wouldn't necessarily need to be an academy trust. I suppose these messages, perhaps read in one way, would suggest that we will see a cooling off within the sector. But time will tell. But so far, if we look at the data over the last 3 years, the average number of schools per MAT continues to rise. So, MATs are getting bigger. And so perhaps the messaging isn't necessarily aligning with reality at this point in time. Next slide, please. Brilliant. So what are we seeing? I think, as I mentioned at the outset, that we are seeing finances come under strain, and the financial position is perhaps not quite as strong as it had been a couple of years ago. And as a result, we are seeing more and more gag and reserve pooling, and I think the graph on the right-hand side certainly shows that. We are also seeing, partly because of that, but also due to economy scales and schools getting to a point that I think a central function is required. We are seeing the central function, for want of a better word, growing, and certainly more skilled individuals and specialists are sitting at trust level rather than individual school level. So we are seeing top slicing inevitably having to increase to keep up with the larger central costs, I suppose, and that's shown in the bottom of those two graphs there. Next page, please. So I suppose picking up on the point I just raised, that perhaps the new government, the Labour government, have a slightly cooler view of the academy sector. We may see fewer schools entering trust. We might see fewer of the larger trusts being developed. But I thought it would be interesting to hear the people on the call to see what they're expecting in the short term, being the next 12 months. I think beyond that, you probably need a crystal ball, but in the next 12 months, I think we should have some visibility. So the question is, do you expect your trust to take on new schools within the next 12 months? Please open the poll. Again, Do you expect your trust to take on new schools within the next 12 months? 3 answers being yes, no, and depends. Please, could you vote or enter the poll? Okay, so it'll be interesting to see. I suspect many will be already in due diligence phase or discussions, and we'll have some visibility of how many schools will be entering their trust in the next 12 months. Let's close it there and see the results. Okay, that's interesting. So so perhaps the majority are seeing us perhaps a levelling off, which would match what the benchmarking is showing, and perhaps some of the mood music in the sector is being filtered down to trust level. So interesting to see that overall the result is perhaps that trust will not continue to grow at the same level that we've seen previously. Time will tell, I suppose, and by this time next year, when we go through the benchmarking report, we'll be able to see whether that rings true. Brilliant. Please, could you close that? And next slide, please. Okay, so moving to governance. I think the messaging here has been similar now for a few years. The board demographics has been an issue. You tend to see slightly more grey-haired male and females sitting on trust boards, and perhaps enticing and encouraging the younger generation to join the board has been an issue. There has been some positivity this year, so perhaps we're seeing a movement, but it's not unsurprising that younger individuals, probably working and perhaps with young families and so on, perhaps do not have the time to take on board responsibilities. But I think it goes broader than just age. Ethnic minorities tend to be less well represented, and equally there does seem to be some data that suggests education does have an impact, and the majority of trust members seem to be university graduates. So there is a lot of work for the sector to do, and I think it's important to say it goes beyond the academy sector. This is mirrored and represented across the whole not-for-profit and charity sector. So we are seeing, from a school's point of view, trusts tapping into ex-pupils and the alumni network, perhaps tapping into some of the social enterprises and social schemes that are in the local community. But it does feel, until they reach perhaps some of the underrepresented ethnic minorities and some of the perhaps those who haven't been to university and so on, I think this is going to be a challenge that continues for the next few years and perhaps beyond. So it moves me to the third bullet point: recruitment and unfilled vacancies. Due to all of what I've just said, we are seeing lots of unfilled vacancies in the sector. So I think a lot of work needs to be done, and perhaps some government intervention at some point as well. What that would look like, I'm not sure. Governance professionals, pleased to see that over the last few years, this report has been banging the drum that getting governance professionals involved is key, and the financial handbook and accounts direction have also supported that. We are seeing now that nearly all multi-academy trusts, I think it was 87% of multi-academy trusts, have a governance professional attending board meetings. And I think for your larger trusts, that's up to nearly 100% of trusts have a governance professional, which I think is good for the sector. External reviews, again, we are seeing more independent reviews of governance, or governance reviews being carried out. For a number of years, it seemed to be a self-assessment, or perhaps an accountant or solicitor or something similar that sits on your board would carry out a review. But there is sometimes a self-fulfilling prophecy there, and perhaps you know what you know and not what you don't know, if that makes sense. So we are seeing more and more external reviews from external professionals being carried out, which I think is good for the sector and should hopefully lead to have a positive impact on governance framework going forward. Next slide, please. So we move towards the end of our webinar today. Challenges and future trends. I suppose I'd start by saying there's always lots of developments in the academy sector and the wider educational sector, and I think this year is no different. I think I've picked up on some of the uncertainty over Labour government plans. I think there's still a lot of information to come out, but as it currently stands, we're not quite sure what it looks like. And some of the information coming out, for example, not all new schools would need to join an academy. Do the local authority have the appetite or the funds or resources to set up schools from scratch? Unsure is the answer there. We mentioned the independent schools earlier in the fallout there. As I say, some news outlets have predicted that there will be a huge movement of pupils out of the independent school sector into the academy sector. Not convinced we've seen that yet. We do at James Cooper Kreston also act for a number of independent schools. We may see pupils moving from one independent school to another independent school, but we haven't necessarily seen a huge amount leaving the sector altogether. But we're still early days. VAT was only brought in within the last couple of months. Recruitment, and I think that picks up on some of the points Becky made earlier. Recruitment continues to be an issue. There are a number of unfilled vacancies, and I suppose it's a bit similar to the governance point earlier, but on a teacher point of view. Is the government enticing enough or sufficient grads or school leavers into the sector? I think a change in government policy or some shift is going to be needed at some point in the future. Increased staff costs, as Becky mentioned, we've got some unfunded staff costs on the horizon. We've got the employers' NI, both the main rate going up from 13.8 to 15%, but also probably less hidden, more hidden, would be the drop in thresholds from when NI kicks in. So this is clearly going to have an impact on school budgets or trust budgets. Likewise, national minimum wage may be an issue with some of the non-teaching members of staff. And lastly, artificial intelligence. Like in all walks of life and all sectors, this is going to come into play. And I think, is there a way over a period of time of cutting some of those costs by using AI? Don't claim to be an AI specialist myself, but I think it's something that clearly all educational establishments will need to grapple with over the next few years. Next slide, please. So just before we finish, I thought I'd finish with one last poll question. I suppose it picks up on the last slide. What is the biggest challenge facing trusts or facing your trust? Let's start the poll. What is the biggest challenge facing your trust? So we've listed out a few perhaps options here. It's not an exhaustive list. I'm sure there's lots of other challenges out there that we face day to day and month to month. But the ones we've listed here is rising costs, government policy, and recruitment, or all of the above, which I suspect might be the answer for some. Please start the poll. Thank you. Please close. Interestingly, a real mix. Rising cost, unsurprisingly, as I mentioned, employers' NI, national minimum wage, and general staff costs. And Becky picked up on pension impacts that perhaps, although were rolled out a little while, will continue to be an issue. So it's clear that rising costs are going to be an issue, and energy, which I didn't mention. Government policy and recruitment less so, and I suppose the government policy is a very broad-ranging option, but recruitment is interesting. That only 7%, when some of the publications and correspondence seem to suggest it's a larger issue than perhaps our small population today are seeing. And then all of the above, yes, absolutely, can absolutely see that and appreciate that. Brilliant. If we could close that, please. Next slide. I've still got that. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so we have now reached the end of our webinar today. Again, my details and Becky's details, and thank you, Becky, for your help today, and some useful links through to our website and the Academy pages, and also our Academies Benchmarking Report. As always, please do reach out to your usual James Cooper Kreston contact or myself or Becky, and we'd be pleased to help with any questions you may have. So I think that just leaves me to say thank you very much for all of your input today. Thank you for participating in the polls, and I wish you the best rest of day, and I'm sure we'll all catch up soon. Take care. Bye.